India's history isn't just written in ancient texts or carved into stone temples, it's carried in the DNA of its people. From snow-covered Himalayan villages to palm-lined southern coasts, the genetic code of modern Indians holds clues to a 5,000-year journey. It's a journey filled with migration, mixing, isolation, and change. For years, historians relied on archaeology and linguistics to piece together India's past. But now, a new tool is changing everything: ancient DNA. By examining the remains of people who lived thousands of years ago, scientists can now see where they came from, who they mixed with, and how today's diverse Indian population came to be. And the results are challenging long-held ideas. This genetic story doesn't follow a single straight path. Instead, it's like a river fed by many streams. Indigenous hunter-gatherers, early farmers from what is now Iran, Indo-European speakers from the steppes of Central Asia, Dravidian-speaking communities from the south, and later arrivals from Central Asia, Persia, and even Europe, all left their mark on Indian DNA. What's most fascinating is how all of these people didn't just come and go. They stayed, intermarried, and built layered communities. Over generations, this created a population that is incredibly mixed but also shaped by geography, language, and even social rules like caste. Each group, whether tribal or urban, carries its own blend of ancient lineages. In this series, we'll trace that journey from the Harappan era to modern times, guided by what science is now uncovering. It's not just a story of where Indians came from, it's a story of how people from many places became Indian over thousands of years. For over a century, the Indus Valley Civilization, also known as the Harappan Civilization, has fascinated archaeologists and historians. With its orderly cities, advanced drainage systems, and undeciphered script, it stood as one of the world's earliest urban societies. But while bricks and seals told us how the Harappans lived, they told us little about who they really were. That changed with the arrival of ancient DNA research. Until recently, the Harappans were a genetic mystery. The hot and humid climate of South Asia made it difficult to find well-preserved human remains. But in 2019, scientists made a breakthrough. They successfully extracted ancient DNA from a woman buried at Rakhigarhi, one of the largest Harappan cities, located in present-day Haryana, India. What the scientists found was unexpected. The DNA from the Rakhigarhi individual showed a strong connection to ancient Iranian agriculturalists, but without the characteristic genetic markers of the Indo-European steppe pastoralists who would later enter India. This confirmed that the Harappans were not related to the people who brought Indo-European languages to South Asia. Instead, they were part of an older wave of people who likely migrated from the Iranian plateau thousands of years earlier, bringing early farming practices with them. But this ancient Iranian ancestry wasn't the whole story. The Rakhigarhi genome also showed signs of deep ancestry tied to South Asian hunter-gatherers. This meant the Harappans were not recent migrants or outsiders, they were a unique blend. They were shaped by local foragers and by early farmers who had arrived and settled centuries before. This blending created a distinct population that formed the backbone of the civilization. Interestingly, this same combination of ancestries can still be seen in many modern Indians today, especially in people from southern India and tribal communities. It shows that the Harappans didn't vanish. Their genetic legacy continued, even after their cities declined around 1900 BCE. Their descendants likely moved east and south, contributing to later cultures and forming the foundation for the South Asian genetic profile. What's also surprising is what the Harappan DNA didn't show. There was no trace of steppe ancestry, the kind associated with the later Indo-Aryan migrations. This means the mixing between the Harappans and the steppe pastoralists happened only after the fall of the Indus cities. It separates the Harappan cultural world from the one that followed, adding a new layer of complexity to Indian history. In the end, DNA has given the Harappans a voice that their undeciphered script could not. They were not invaders, nor simply vanished people. They were deeply rooted in the subcontinent, connected to both the land and early farming traditions from the West. And most importantly, they were the ancestors of millions of Indians alive today. For a long time, the idea of Aryans arriving in India was a subject of heated debate. Were they invaders, migrants, or part of a gradual cultural shift? What we now know, thanks to genetic research, is that the story is far more detailed and scientifically grounded than past assumptions. Genetic evidence points to a major demographic movement from the Central Asian steppes into South Asia around 2000 to 1500 BCE. These people, often linked to the Yamnaya and later Andronovo cultures, carried a genetic signature known as steppe ancestry. This ancestry is tied to the same population that spread Indo-European languages across much of Europe and Asia. When scientists looked at ancient DNA from South Asia and compared it to DNA from Bronze Age steppe populations, the results were striking. Populations in northern India, particularly those speaking Indo-Aryan languages, show a significant degree of steppe-related ancestry. This was especially visible in the Y chromosome haplogroups, passed from father to son, where a high presence of haplogroup R1az93, a marker of steppe pastoralists, was found. Interestingly, this genetic input wasn't evenly spread. Steppe ancestry is more prominent in northern and higher caste groups and less so in southern and tribal populations. This pattern aligns with the ancient spread of Vedic culture, Sanskrit language, and the caste system, all believed to have intensified after these steppe peoples arrived. But the picture is not just about migration, it's about interaction. The steppe pastoralists didn't arrive in an empty land. By the time they reached South Asia, the Indus Valley civilization had declined, but its people still lived across the region. Genetic mixing occurred between these steppe migrants and local populations, especially groups with Harappan ancestry. This fusion played a key role in shaping what we now recognize as the genetic and cultural foundations of northern India. Linguistic evidence also supports this genetic narrative. The Indo-Aryan branch of the Indo-European language family took root in South Asia during this same period. The Vedas, some of the oldest Hindu scriptures, were composed in an early form of Sanskrit that shares grammar and vocabulary with languages from ancient Iran and even Europe, another clue pointing to the steppe connection. Still, it's important to note that the term Aryan has been misused in history to promote racial or political ideologies. What the science tells us today is not about superiority or purity, but about shared ancestry and migration. The steppe pastoralists were just one of many populations that contributed to the genetic mosaic of the Indian subcontinent. In short, the Aryan migration was real, but it wasn't a story of conquest alone. It was a complex movement of people, culture, and genes. Their arrival introduced new elements, but they also became part of the diverse fabric already woven by earlier South Asian civilizations. DNA gives us a clearer view. The past was not black and white, but layered, blended, and far more interconnected than we imagined. Long before Indo-Aryan languages took root in the north of the Indian subcontinent, another cultural and genetic foundation was thriving in the south. This layer, deeply rooted in ancient times, is associated with Dravidian-speaking populations and a genetic ancestry known today as ASI, short for Ancient South Indian. This component represents one of the most distinct and enduring threads in the Indian genome. The ASI ancestry is thought to have emerged from a blend of indigenous South Asian hunter-gatherers and early farming communities. These groups lived in the subcontinent long before the arrival of steppe pastoralists or even the peak of the Indus Valley civilization. While ancient DNA samples directly from the south are limited, the genetic traces of ASI ancestry remain strong in modern populations, especially in southern India and tribal communities across the peninsula. Dravidian languages, like Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, and Malayalam, are spoken by millions today, and they likely evolved from the early languages spoken by ASI-rich populations. Interestingly, many scholars believe that Dravidian languages may have once been spoken across a much broader area, including parts of the Indus Valley, before the spread of Indo-Aryan dialects. This hints at an even wider cultural footprint for ASI-related peoples in ancient times. When scientists study modern South Indian populations, especially non-Brahmin and rural communities, they often find a higher proportion of ASI ancestry compared to the North. However, it's rarely pure in the genetic sense. Instead, ASI ancestry appears in varying degrees, often intermixed with components from steppe ancestry, Iranian farmer ancestry, and other ancient lineages. This shows that gene flow has been constant across regions, even if cultural and linguistic divisions were maintained. What makes ASI ancestry especially fascinating is that it represents a deep time continuity. While other genetic influences arrived in waves, like the steppe-related groups, the ASI component has been present for tens of thousands of years. It reflects the legacy of some of the earliest humans to settle the Indian subcontinent after the out-of-Africa migrations. Furthermore, some archaeological and linguistic evidence suggests early ASI-related societies developed their own complex cultures, including farming, trade, and regional kingdoms. The megalithic sites found across southern India, stone structures, burial sites, and tools, may be the archaeological echo of these long-standing societies, shaped by ASI ancestry. In modern genetics, ASI is not a precise population but a reconstructed ancestral component. It's defined more by the absence of steppe or Iranian-related DNA than by any single group. Still, this invisible signature continues to inform our understanding of identity, history, and diversity in the subcontinent. The legacy of ASI ancestry is not confined to the past. It lives on in millions of people today, especially among those whose cultural traditions, languages, and communities trace their roots to southern India. In this way, the story of the ASI is not just an ancient one, it's also a living chapter of India's rich genetic heritage. The Indian caste system is often seen as a social structure, but recent genetic research has revealed that it also left a deep imprint in the DNA of modern Indians. Surprisingly, this ancient system of hierarchy and separation may have formed as a result of both cultural blending and growing social rigidity over time. When we look back several thousand years, we find that the Indian subcontinent was home to a mix of ancestral groups. These included the ancient South Indians, ASI, early Iranian-related farmers, and later arriving steppe pastoralists who are associated with the spread of Indo-Aryan languages. Initially, these groups intermarried freely. Genetic studies show that between roughly 2000 BCE and 1000 BCE, there was widespread mixing among different communities across the subcontinent. This period of openness created what scientists call an admixture zone, where diverse ancestries blended. But then, something changed. Starting around 1000 BCE, the mixing sharply declined. For the next 2,000 years, people increasingly married within their own groups, and rigid social boundaries began to form. This shift coincides with the early formation of caste-like categories, possibly influenced by the spread of Vedic texts and social codes that emphasized purity, lineage, and occupational roles. Genetic studies back this up. Many present-day Indian communities show clear signs of endogamy, marriage within the same group, for hundreds or even thousands of years. This practice has left behind strong genetic signatures, including higher levels of shared DNA within castes and reduced genetic diversity in some groups compared to others. What's striking is how this stratification varied by region. In the north, populations tend to have more steppe-related ancestry, which is associated with the Indo-Aryan migration. In contrast, southern and tribal populations often show more ASI-related ancestry. But because of caste endogamy, these ancestral components have stayed somewhat separate even within the same geographic area. In short, two neighboring villages might speak the same language but carry quite different genetic histories based on caste divisions. Caste wasn't just about who people married, it shaped how people lived, worked, and moved. Occupational roles, social interactions, and even access to resources were influenced by this system, and over generations, that also affected who mixed with whom genetically. However, genetics also shows that caste is not as ancient or fixed as some traditional narratives claim. The earliest populations in India were not divided along strict caste lines. Rather, caste as we know it likely evolved over time, solidified by social, political, and religious forces. In that sense, the genetic record offers both a challenge to and a clarification of historical beliefs. Today, as more people intermarry across caste lines, especially in urban areas, the old boundaries are slowly beginning to fade. Yet the echoes of caste can still be seen in DNA, reminders of how culture and biology can intertwine in shaping human history. India's genetic history didn't stop with the arrival of the Indo-Aryans. Over the centuries, the subcontinent witnessed waves of new migrations and invasions, each leaving its own subtle mark on the genetic and cultural landscape. Among these were the Greeks, Persians, Turks, and Mongols. After Alexander the Great's invasion around 326 BCE, a number of Greek settlers remained in the northwestern parts of the Indian subcontinent. These Indo-Greeks ruled regions of modern-day Pakistan and Afghanistan for generations. Though their population was small, they mixed into local communities, particularly in urban centers. Modern DNA studies of people from these regions show faint but detectable traces of European ancestry that may, in part, reflect this Hellenistic influence. Even earlier, the Persian Achaemenid Empire had extended into parts of northwestern India. Trade, governance, and military integration during this time fostered interaction between Persians and local populations. Some genetic markers found in northwestern India show continuity with ancient Iranian lineages, though these may also overlap with earlier Neolithic Iranian ancestry already present from earlier migrations. From the 11th century onward, Turkic and Central Asian groups arrived, most notably during the Delhi Sultanate and Mughal Empire. These rulers brought not just armies but also families, artisans, and administrators from Central Asia. Genetic studies show Central Asian and Turkic ancestry among certain northern Indian populations, especially those historically connected to Muslim communities and ruling elites. However, this genetic contribution, while real, remains relatively modest compared to the deeper layers of indigenous ancestry. The Mongol invasions of the 13th century had less direct genetic impact. While the Mongol Empire touched the fringes of the subcontinent, their presence was more fleeting compared to the more sustained influence of Turks and Persians. Still, isolated cases of East Asian ancestry have been identified in some communities, possibly linked to Mongol-era movements or intermarriages along ancient trade routes like the Silk Road. Overall, these later migrations added complexity to India's genetic story. Their genetic legacy is subtle compared to earlier waves like the Aryan or Dravidian layers, but it remains embedded in the DNA of specific populations. Rather than replacing earlier inhabitants, these groups were woven into the social and cultural fabric, adding yet another chapter to India's long, intertwined history of migration and blending. India today is home to over 1 billion people, speaking hundreds of languages and belonging to thousands of communities. Yet beneath this visible diversity lies an equally rich genetic landscape, one shaped by thousands of years of migration, mixing, isolation, and adaptation. Modern DNA research has shown that nearly every region of India carries the genetic echoes of both ancient and recent history. At the broadest level, scientists describe two major ancestral components, the ancient ancestral South Indians, ASI, and the ancestral North Indians, ANI. The ASI ancestry is more dominant in southern and tribal populations, while the ANI component is stronger in the north. But no group is purely one or the other. Every Indian today carries some blend of both. Layered over this foundational ancestry are traces of older movements, like the Neolithic Iranian-related farmers who brought early agriculture, or the steppe pastoralists who arrived during the 2nd millennium BCE, contributing to the spread of Indo-European languages. These older events still show up clearly in modern Indian genomes, especially when researchers study markers like Y-DNA and mtDNA lineages. India's long history of trade and empire also added new threads to this genetic fabric. Coastal populations, especially in Gujarat, Kerala, and Bengal, show evidence of connections to West Asia, East Africa, and even Southeast Asia, reflecting centuries of maritime exchange. Northern groups, especially those linked historically to ruling or merchant classes, may carry minor but detectable traces of Central Asian, Persian, or even European ancestry. At the same time, many Indian populations remain genetically isolated for long periods due to endogamy, the practice of marrying within one's caste or community. This created high levels of genetic distinctiveness within groups. Some communities have unique genetic signatures not found anywhere else in the world. The result is that India's genetic map is not a smooth gradient but a mosaic, complex, patterned, and deeply historical. Every region, caste, and tribal group has its own story written in DNA. Together, these stories don't just tell us where Indians come from, but how countless peoples came together, stayed apart, or reconnected through time. India's genetic map today is a living record of thousands of years of human experience, of movement and settlement, of boundaries and bridges, of ancestry and adaptation. The Indian genome holds more than just the blueprint of physical traits. It carries the memory of an ancient, diverse, and interconnected past. Through modern genetics, we're learning that Indian identity is far more layered than myths, politics, or even history books have claimed. For years, identity in India has been shaped by language, caste, religion, and region. But DNA tells a deeper story, one that cuts across these divisions. It shows that all Indians, whether from Kashmir or Kerala, whether tribal or urban, carry shared ancestral roots. Everyone is part of a long and complex journey that includes early South Asian hunter-gatherers, Neolithic farmers from Iran, steppe pastoralists from Central Asia, and even traders and migrants from Africa, Europe, and East Asia. This genetic reality challenges ideas of purity and separateness. While communities may have lived in social isolation for generations, their distant ancestors often came from the same places. The caste system, which has created rigid social boundaries, is a recent layer over a much older, more fluid genetic history. At the same time, the genome respects diversity. India's endogamous traditions have created genetic signatures unique to specific groups, which means that both shared ancestry and distinctiveness coexist. A tribal woman in Jharkhand and a Brahmin man in Uttar Pradesh might look and live differently, but on a deep genetic level, their stories are intertwined. In a time of rising identity politics, the genome offers a reminder: India is not built on a single origin story. It is a blend, a subcontinent of blended ancestries, shaped by movement, adaptation, and resilience. Understanding this doesn't erase identity, it deepens it. It gives Indians the chance to embrace their complexity, to see unity not in sameness, but in shared human experience written into their very DNA.